Great. I want to welcome everybody to our lunch and learn, legal lunch and learn, we should say. And today's topic is the update on telemedicine, on what's going on, and also related to COVID, the new laws taking place both nationally and federally. And to explain all those new laws, we have healthcare law partners, Ben Mercer and his partners. So Ben, why don't you go ahead, take it over?
Hey guys, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Ben Mirza. I'm with Healthcare Law Partners. We are a small and burgeoning law firm, but we all practice in the area of just healthcare. And today's seminar is on the legal updates of telehealth rules and regulations. We're going to talk about what best practices and the current waivers. Wait, hold on one second. Komal, are you a co-host on this?
Yes,
I am not. I was
she
actually
was.
just.
She
Yeah,
was, but then she left, and now I'm gonna have to make her again. So
yeah. So
Thank you.
yeah, but I'll keep going. But with that said, today's seminar is about gaining awareness of the rules and regulations in the telehealth space. It's about understanding the emergency waivers that are in place, put together by CMS. The people that would be appropriate to actually attend this would be healthcare administrators and physicians and practice managers alike. Even some legal counsels who are not involved generally in the telehealth space. This would be actually a very informative seminar for them as well. The presentation here is intended for general informational purposes. It's an educational session. It's not legal advice. So if you have a specific question that's unique to your particular scenario, please do look us up afterwards. But you're welcome to ask any general question that you wish during the seminar. The seminar is on an open and live forum. It is being recorded as we speak, and it will be posted later on an open video platform. So for further reference. With that said, just to give you a little bit of a background of who we are and how we got to be speakers today, I am actually formerly an accountant. I was a certified public accountant. I say was only because my continuing education credits, I just couldn't keep up with those. So I dropped it and didn't need it, frankly. And I transitioned into being an attorney about 20 years ago. And in the last, over my career, I've actually reviewed well over 1,000 contracts, probably worth well over $3 billion worth of transactional value on the contracts. And I've litigated about 2,000 cases, pretty significantly, and that's a pretty significant load. I've been inside large law firms and small law firms, and I've been inside large organizations as well, like for example, large size healthcare systems. And we do work for physician groups and healthcare software companies. So that's our background. That's what I do, but I've only been practicing for 20 years. With us today, we have the Yoda of healthcare, and that is Ed Meyer. Ed, you want to talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah. So I'm Ed Meyer. I'm of counsel to Healthcare Law Partners. I am licensed in California, so I deal with federal law matters. But I've been practicing this June for 30 years in the healthcare law. Even before that, I was working in Washington, D.C. for a member of Congress, and then for the Reagan administration at Department of Health and Human Services. And so my background goes back in the healthcare law area. I've represented the full array of healthcare providers and suppliers, from individual physicians to medium-sized physician groups to even national physician groups, and hospitals, from small rural hospitals to large healthcare systems, and in addition, representing individual healthcare providers, just licensees. I'm a regulatory attorney, healthcare regulatory attorney. I'm not a litigator. That I leave that to Ben. and Como, but I get lost on the way to the courthouse. But mentioning Como, Como is our featured speaker today. Let me introduce here is Como. Please give us your background.
Good afternoon. My name is Komal Mirza. Thank you, Ed, for the introduction. I am an attorney with Healthcare Law Partners. My primary practice area is in employment law and helping physicians and physician groups establish their practices with a particular focus to risk management. And so today's conversation is actually a very interesting one in terms of risk management and a really great avenue for new practitioners to look into, as well as those of you who have been in the field for a longer period of time. Prior to COVID-19, it was estimated that about 18% of physicians actually provided telehealth services to their patients. After this pandemic is over, it's approximated that about 50% of physicians will be providing telehealth services. So it is important to keep abreast of what the developments are in this arena. And the primary forces that are bringing about this change in healthcare is the patient demand for efficiency, convenience, and ease of access, as well as safety. Many patients do express a concern for risk of exposure while they go into a clinic. And the convenience is actually interesting because typically an in-person visit takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours for a patient. Whereas with telehealth, it's expected to take about anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. So that's a significant issue in terms of convenience. So the best time, of course, is to look into telehealth is now. Today's objectives primarily focus around the best practices, regardless of whether there's a pandemic, the COVID era 19 waivers, and what telehealth is most likely going to look like moving forward once the pandemic is over. So before we go into the substantive matter here of the presentation, I do want to quickly go over what telemedicine is, because it is important to have a foundation and an understanding of what the different terms are going to be used during the presentation. Now, telemedicine, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is the use of electronic information and telecommunication tools to support and promote the provision of healthcare and continuity of healthcare for patients. There's two models. There's synchronous telehealth, which is real-time audio and visual. And then there's asynchronous, which is store and forward type technologies or remote monitoring.
Yeah, a quick story I want to throw in, but putting telehealth in perspective, and what we were actually trying to do is back actually before I was in law school, and actually when I was just entering college, I used to work for my father's glass company. He was a glazing contractor, and that was at the end. Put it in perspective, at the end of the disco era. You put it way back when. But he would make a piece of glass, get from a customer a piece of glass, and glass doesn't stretch, right? It has to be exact, and then you need a frame for the glass. But he'd order the frame, and you can't call up the frame manufacturer and say this is the dimensions. You have to put together a schematic with the precise measurements. So he would hand me the schematic, and I would drive across town in San Francisco and deliver that schematic, and then drive all the way across. Just to make sure that the frame manufacturer was making it exactly the size of the piece of glass that to fit into. Again, to be precise, and it would take about an hour and a half. But then my dad gets this this machine. It's like a rolling machine that smelled, and you put the piece of paper in it, and it rolled, and for 15 minutes on the telephone, and it would get that that document over to the the frame manufacturer who had the same machine. And that was like the first iteration of a fax machine, and that saved time. Like it went from an hour and a half to go back and forth to 15 minutes. And again, being as precise. But again, what you're doing in telehealth, we've gone from an era of, way back when, where I remember as a child, a physician making home visits, to go to the office now at the telehealth medicine. And again, being precise, getting that information precisely through the electronic telemedicine modality. So just never forget that what we're trying to achieve is, convenience for the patient, but ensuring quality care through the precision of that back and forth, the audio and the visual interaction with the patient.
That's actually,
Disco era, huh?
Disco, yeah, that was a late disco era. Yes.
you guys are too much. I have no idea what you're talking about. But the consequence of being the young gun, right?
Yes.
So moving on. So the first area of best practices that you want to pay attention to is your form of data transmission. You really want to make sure that your whatever method you're using for providing telehealth services is HIPAA compliant. So what does that mean? That means that you want to use a non-public facing platform with end-to-end encryption. And typically there are providers want to use a subscription-based platform, and particularly a one that is that has signed a HIPAA business associate agreement. And that what that does is provide more additional assurances that the platform and the end-to-end encryption are all HIPAA compliant.
What not in public facing platform? What if you're at Starbucks or at the airport and the physician wants to do the visit interaction? What about that?
So you actually want to avoid doing that. Any public Wi-Fi sources do not have end-to-end encryption. They are public facing. The public has access to it. And so it does leave a lot of vulnerabilities as far as HIPAA is concerned. So you want to avoid using those types of internet sources while you're doing your telehealth visit. Also, I mean, you have the issue of people walking behind you, right? You can't really control the population group in a Starbucks or the airport. And you don't want to expose your patient to the possibility of others listening in or being able to see or participate in the telehealth visit. So that's a good question, Ed. Additionally, you want to make sure that you are keeping proper records as far as the telehealth visit is concerned. And this is very sensitive because you want to make sure that you signify or identify the type of telehealth method that's used, the patient and provider's names and locations. You want to be specific with the location. So ideally you would provide the address of both the provider's location and the patient's location. You also want to make note of who else attended the telehealth visit and what their specific roles were, and whether the patient consented to having this telehealth visit or initiated the visit. And this is important because most carriers will not cover telehealth unless the patient either first initiated it or at least consented. And then finally,
let me ask you this.
Yeah.
I have a question. What if a patient shows up and you don't actually see them physically, and instead they actually do a telehealth thing in the hallway, from the hallway? Because let's say they show up with some sort of symptom and you don't want to get close to them. Is that a telehealth visit, or is that an on-site visit, or what is? How would you define that under these rules?
Well, considering the fact that you would have now the same location for the patient and the provider, it would not be considered a telehealth visit.
The same physical address, that's what we're talking
Right.
about, the locations. Even though it's, your one's in let's say in an office, the exam room, I should say, and the physician may be down the hall in his own office, but keeping separate from the patient, but having that interaction electronically. But again, at the same office address, same address. Even if you go to the parking lot, the patient's in the parking lot at that address.
Yeah, and that was actually occurring with the parking lot issue earlier on, and when COVID onset.
Yeah,
So again, it wouldn't qualify as a telehealth visit for purposes of reimbursement.
that's exactly
Good
right.
to know.
And so it is important that's why it's so important to have both your patient's location, but also you as a provider. And if there's a discrepancy in terms of location, you're gonna jeopardize your payout or payment of benefits. So, and finally, the major thing that you want to pay attention to is making sure that you're recording everything that would be typically recorded during an in-person visit during your telehealth visit as well. So if it's, you know, basic information like height, weight, blood pressure, all of that, you want to make sure that you go ahead and make a note of that in the in-person visit. Now, of
And
course,
I always want to mention one thing too. Keep in mind that, you know, if you're using electronic means, you have to also be careful about cutting and pasting. You know, height, weight, those information, you may get it from the record from before, but that's not the current record. So make sure you're asking the patient and getting the height, weight information so it's current. And because if y'all are, I say, copying some from other record and putting it in there, and that information is not the actual information that was exchanged or accurate at that time, then you always are at risk for a false claim. Because all that information is part of it can be part of the claim that qualified for that particular CCP code for which you billed under. And so just, you know, cutting and pasting, you got to be very, very careful about that, or taking information from a prior record, a prior encounter with the patient and just putting it in this record because effectively you're kind of doing the same thing, but make sure that that information is all absolutely correct and is the correct thing.
that's exactly right. Thank you for pointing that out, Ed, because I think it's very easy to copy and paste these days. So you just want to make sure that you're not overdoing it there. And so, of course, the pitfall here to pay attention to is if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And if it didn't happen, you can't bill for it. So just make sure you're properly documenting. Thirdly, you want to pay attention to your insurance coverage. Professional liability insurance policies do not always cover telehealth services. So you really want to make sure that your carrier and your policy both provide for coverage in telehealth services. The best way to do that is to contact your carrier and confirm with them, and to add on coverage if you don't have it. Additionally, you want to pay attention to cybersecurity insurance. It provides coverage in the event that that the telecommunication servers that you're using are breached or compromised, and it'll help provide coverage for you in terms of that. So you really don't want to get blindsided, and you want to make sure that you're covered both professionally on the web. And finally, these are the best practices in terms of billing. You want to make sure that the health insurance policy for your patient actually covers telehealth services. Not all policies do. So ask your patient to either confirm or have your office's administrative hand make sure that it's covered by the insurance policy that the patient carries. Also, you want to make sure that you make note of whether the telehealth visit is medically necessary in your best judgment prior to providing the service, and that you have a prior established in-person relationship between your practice and your patient. So these are the main three things that you really have to make sure that you have when you are initiating a telehealth service, so that you can maximize the benefit of it for both you as a provider and for the patient. Now that we've covered the basics of best practices in telehealth, I want to discuss with you the significant waivers and guidances that are currently in place as a result of the current pandemic, and how they kind of impact your best practices for a temporary period. So currently, the three agencies that have issued waivers and guidances are the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, specifically their Office of Civil Rights, which is charged with pursuing prosecution of any violations committed through under the Health and Human Services regulations. You also want to take a look at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They've provided a CMS 1135 waiver, And finally, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has issued a guidance pertaining to 42 CFR Part 2. Now, these waivers and guidances are expected to remain in place because the Biden-Harris administration has announced that the national public health emergency is likely to stay in place through the end of this year. So these waivers are thus expected to remain in place, but there is a possibility that they may be rescinded at any given time. And typically these departments or agencies will provide a 60-day written notice of any changes. Of course, if you want to stay up to date, go ahead and bookmark our healthcareattorney.net website. We will be providing necessary updates as they're announced by the administration.
Keep in mind that these waivers are being issued under declared public health emergency. And under the declared public health emergency, the government has the authority, which they exercised last March, last April, to waive, and that's what these waivers are, to waive existing regulations. So once that public health emergency is no longer in place, that authority to waive is gone, which is why it's very important to, why I guess the administration has kept a declaration on that this emergency will last until the end of December. And that at that time, to make permanent any of these changes, they would have to actually, after the waiver of public health emergency is no longer declared, when that authority is no longer available, those waivers being going away, to make anything permanent, they would have to issue new regulations, and new regulations under the notice and comment period in the Administrative Procedures Act. So again, it's very important to keep in mind these dates and to keep vigilant as these changes can all go back, or many could go back to the way it was before or be modified.
Thank you, Ed. So the first two notifications that I want to discuss with you are those issued by the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The first notification was actually issued on March 17th of last year, and the OCR announced that they would be exercising their discretion in prosecuting HIPAA violations through the use of telemedicine. And the purpose of that was to encourage physicians and healthcare providers to provide services to their patients, regardless of where they're located, especially during the public health emergency. And then the second notice that was issued was that on January 19th of this year, and the OCR announced that they would also be extending their exercise of discretion to include HIPAA violations that may occur through the use of online scheduling applications for the purpose of COVID vaccine appointments. And this was really to ensure that the COVID vaccine is efficiently and safely administered to the public. Of course, it's important to note here that these notifications are expressly announcing that the office is going to be exercising its discretion. So what that means is that they will be looking at HIPAA violations on a case-to-case basis and determining whether they should move forward with prosecution or whether they can let it slide based on the current circumstances and environment. And so what does that mean, right? And that means that you want to pay attention to the platforms that you're using for telehealth and telemedicine, and that you are employing good faith efforts in providing those services to your patients. You want to make sure that you're using non-public facing communication platforms. This is important because currently HHS does not require or look for providers using HIPAA compliant or HIPAA BAA signed platforms. So that means currently providers are allowed to use a standard Zoom subscription or FaceTime or Skype. All of these modes of telecommunication are currently permitted by the HHS. But you want to be careful about exactly what form you're using. You don't want to use public-facing platforms. Public-facing platforms include apps like Snapchat or Facebook Live. Those are forms of communication through which people, the public, can really join in on the conversation. And you don't want the public joining in on the conversation. So just avoid those platforms. And so you also want to pay attention to the requirement that I previously discussed, which was a requirement for a prior established relationship with the patient and between the telemedicine provider. That requirement is currently waived. So practitioners are able to provide services, telehealth services to new patients. And how this is going to change moving forward is a key pointer. And so just stay tuned for the end of this conversation to learn exactly how that could change moving forward. Secondly, I would like to discuss with you the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services 1135 waiver. This was issued on March 6th of last year. And what it essentially did was it expanded telehealth services for Medicare patients. Under this waiver, the telehealth services are no longer limited to patients that are residing in a designated rural area, and they can actually receive the service in their home now. Previously, CMS required that the patient receiving the telehealth visit or telehealth service be residing in a designated rural area, and they actually had to travel to an approved telehealth site. Now, though, for right now, during this public health emergency, those requirements are waived. So you really just want to make sure that you have the appropriate
License, yeah.
license, and right. And so, thank you, Ed. With that in mind, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate licensing to be able to provide telehealth services to your patient. And that's going to be based on where your patient is located. So say if you are a practitioner who typically provides health services in the state of Florida and you're licensed in Florida, but your patient for some reason during this pandemic has gone home to their parents' home in Kentucky, you want to make sure, and you're going to be providing telehealth services to that patient, you want to make sure that you are appropriately licensed in the state of Kentucky to provide healthcare services. And to be able to keep up to date as to whether you have an appropriate licensing, or if you have your license is reciprocated by the state of Kentucky, you can check the Federation of State Medical Boards, and their website provides all of that information on there.
And also keep in mind that make sure if you're practicing across state lines, and again, you're licensed across state lines, is your professional liability insurance is also covering you across those state lines in another state. It's a very, very important piece never to forget.
Yes, and it's a very easy one to overlook. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. It is important for providers to make sure they have liability coverage in that state. So these are some of the billing codes that have been approved under the CMS 1135 waiver. These are available on CMS's website, so just check that to make sure that you are using the appropriate billing codes. It is important to note, or it is nice to know, that a provider who's using synchronous telehealth visits, meaning real-time audio, visual telecommunications for the telehealth visit, they can actually bill that now as an in-person visit. So just keep that in mind as you provide these services to your patients. And finally, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration really wanted to make sure that they addressed the need for their patients, for their patient base to have the appropriate services that they would need during this lockdown and ongoing health emergency. And so they've issued a guidance through which they've waived the prohibition on the use and disclosure of patient identifying information. And so what that means is that if a provider determines that a bona fide medical emergency exists and their patient needs immediate treatment, they may go ahead and identify the patient to the appropriate agencies or service providers to ensure that that patient is adequately cared for, which is, has proven to be very important for many patients during this time. But of course, the important part here that you really want to make sure before you issue any kind of disclosure of patient identifying information is that there is actually a bona fide medical emergency. So these are the basic waivers and guidances that are in place by the various agencies regulating healthcare. And what these waivers are going to look like is going to be a factor that is going to be determined by various factors. These agencies are most likely going to be balancing the practicality of these waivers, the market demand, and really while also balancing those factors with the need to keep healthcare really sound and be able to protect patients and practitioners when it comes to these waivers. A lot of these waivers, while they may seem, a lot of the regulations that have currently been waived may seem inconvenient, they do have a higher purpose, right? And so the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is most likely going to be lifting the discretion on HIPAA violations. So they're most likely going to go back to, they will be going back to fully prosecuting HIPAA violations. And of course, that's for patient protection, right? And then there's the CMS waiver, which will probably become a permanent hybrid, right? You might see both designated rural area patients and non-rural area patients be able to receive telehealth services. And you might even see the patients being able to receive those telehealth services at home without having to travel to a telehealth site moving forward, which would be fantastic. And then of course, SAMHSA is most likely going to be lifting their exemption. Of course, these are all educated guesses based on the current market demands, the current regulations, and how the field of telehealth is expected to move forward once the pandemic is over.
Just to share with you a practical situation that came up. My wife happens to be a physician, and down the street from us, we have neighbors who have a child roughly around our child's age, and they will play together. It was about only 2 weeks ago that we were sitting down and we're having an actual barbecue outside. And during the barbecue, they asked us what our last name was. I guess we never really looked into each other's last names, and we started to get to know each other a little better. And at the end of the conversation, we realized that that couple down the street were patients of my wife's office, right? So she was their primary physician for taking care of what they had going on. But they had signed up to be patient-physician relationship during the COVID era. They'd only had a telehealth appointment. They had not met in person. But they didn't realize that they had that relationship until they actually peeled the onion and talked to each other about what they were doing. What they realized is that my wife had a mask on when they did telehealth because her assistant was in the room with her, so they had to wear a mask. And the husband and wife couple didn't recognize her. And similarly, my wife didn't recognize them, probably because she has about 20 appointments per day. So you know, and things in telehealth can look very different. So in telehealth, what you're not getting is the energy, the ability to actually understand what is going on with the uniqueness of a person's body. What you're not getting is those nuances that only come from seeing people. So obviously there's things that people will miss if they only subscribe to telehealth, and I think that hopefully the regulations will take that into account.
But also, one other thing, keep in mind, remind me, this presentation is recorded for good reason, so we can save it for later. You're doing a Zoom telehealth. There's that recording button, and if it's being recorded, then from a litigation standpoint, keep in mind that is a part of a record that could be subpoenaed in a dispute with the patient on professional liability. And just sort of, you weigh that, because if it's being recorded, you can take every little sentence and take things potentially even out of context. But they also may be good for ensuring that you are safeguarding yourself. So if as a physician, if you are not interested in having things recorded, make sure that's clear to the patient, and then that you disable that ability to be recorded. But also, if you feel like making sure it is recorded, know that recording of the interaction is in a subpoena for documents, is potentially discoverable.
Very good
Good
point,
point.
Ed.
So with that said, if anybody has any questions, we can take them at this time. And if you have a particular private sort of a question, you're welcome to call or email us. And if there's any specific documents you want us to review, we'll review those for you. And if you need us to work on something, we'll actually give you an estimate before we take on the job. So.
I mean, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and feel free to ask them. I have a question for you. What is currently? I know there's legislation going through statewide, federal-wise, for telehealth. Do you have an update on that of kind of where we stand?
And I do not currently have an update on the state of Florida's legislation that may or may not be going through. I am actually currently located in DC, but I'm happy to look into it for you.
Yeah, and I did notice that in the physician fee schedule for 2021, there, which was just finalized as a final rule, there are some, like as Como was mentioning, extensions through the end of a year, or potentially even regulation saying for 6 months after the end of a declared uh, national health emergency. That again gives time for people to get back to the mode they are. And there's a lot of discussion in that physician fee schedule of the government saying, well, now we have a lot of information about how the interaction is with telemedicine. We understand the positives of it, but we also understand that we still want to have direct patient interactions, physical interaction, in-person interactions. I mean.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Charles, just to answer a part of your question regarding the state of Florida, there's actually a standards board that have put together model standards for telemedicine, and they've been waiting on each state to adopt them independently or individually, and probably about a dozen have already signed up. Last year, it was proposed in the Florida legislature, and in 2020, that bill did not pass. So those model rules have not made it into Florida yet, but I'm sure they're going to try it again.
Yeah, I thought that there was some kind of action going through the state legislative right now about telemedicine, to be able to make it kind of on a permanent basis rather than on an emergency basis. I thought that was going on right now, but I may be wrong.
That would make sense. That would be there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But wouldn't you agree? A lot of that also relates to insurance companies agreeing to accept it. So regardless of what it is, you have to have, if I have Florida Blues and they don't accept telehealth, I would think a physician would not want to do that unless you wind up paying for the visit.
Yeah, that makes
Right.
practical sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing to kind of keep in mind is that most state legislatures and these boards actually are looking to see in which way the federal government is moving, right? So the pattern really starts at the top with Department of Health and Human Services and CMS, and then it trickles down into your more local legislations.
Yeah, I guess the good thing about it is they are assigning codes to that, which seems to be that would be more of a movement towards allowing telehealth regularly rather than just on an emergency basis.
Yeah, and I guess definitely at the end of the declared pandemic, and whatever is the situation and the set of laws and regulations in place, they will be much further along the telehealth path than we were before the declared emergency,
Right.
just because of people understanding how to use it, people understanding, patients, both patients and physicians, and again, patient expectations. And that plays a lot in the federal rules and federal regulations, because the federal government, Medicare, Medicaid programs, those regulators, their focus is this is for the patients. We have to deliver care to the patients, and then who are beneficiaries of these federal programs, and understanding that there is a shortage of healthcare providers that are out there to see these enrollees. So things that make it more convenient, more access, are things that do push the final rules to more access.
Right. They Ed, on a federal basis, so that's still being discussed, and there's no final rules at this point in time, but it is being discussed currently, I assume.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. That's
And again, they're getting data. They're getting data, right? Effectively, keep in mind that this has been about a year. They're looking at it, and then they're seeing how the interaction is.
Yeah, from what I hear and talking to some physicians, it seems to be working out very well when used correctly, and using the resources that they have through telehealth and through remote monitoring seems to be some of the best ways to be able to do that. So,
Yeah, but you also have to keep in mind, avoid physician burnout too.
right.
So that's a really important piece.
I've been talking to a couple of physicians who actually have been experiencing that, because with telehealth, they're able to provide their services on a back-to-back basis to their patients. And it's really, they've been overwhelmed by just the sheer number of appointments that they get every day. It's gone easily quadrupled for them.
Right, and having the time to actually document the record afterwards. They have the patient interaction, and then you got to afterwards. You got to get on the record your what you did, and into the record. And again, as keep in mind that as physicians are in an employment model, making sure that the employer have the full understanding of that balance.
So I guess this whole telemedicine may be a time saver for the patients, but not necessarily for the physicians. For the physicians, it sounds like we're getting reports that it's increasing their workload. So
Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Appreciate you guys coming, and this seminar will soon be posted on the South Florida Hospital News Network on the YouTube channel. So you're welcome to watch it there, or if someone that missed it, you can always refer them to that.
Yeah, and we appreciate you coming by. We have been continuing. If you take a look at our website, on my newsletter, you'll see the upcoming events coming up. I guess the next one is going to be is it May 4th, Ben? I don't remember. I don't have it in front of me right now.
1 second, I'll look it right up. One second. The next one is on May 4th, and it's about mergers and acquisitions.
Great.
It's about mergers and acquisitions, and we're calling it the Wolves of Wall Street, how to navigate mergers and acquisitions as it relates to physician practices and hospital systems.
Well, again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and from South Florida Hospital News and Healthcare Law Partners, thank you very much for coming. And if somebody you know would actually benefit from this webinar, please send them to our website in the next couple of days and pick up the link for the current one. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye
Thanks,
bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.